The evening air hung heavy over the 53rd Precinct's jurisdiction, a neighborhood where trust between law enforcement and residents had long since eroded. Malik Thompson moved through the streets with practiced ease, his keen eyes scanning the interactions between local beat cops and civilians. His FBI training had taught him to blend in seamlessly, and after 3 months undercover, he'd mastered the art of being invisible while seeing everything. Wearing worn jeans and a navy hoodie, Malik observed officers Davidson and Martinez accepting something from a local business owner, their movements suspiciously casual. He made mental notes, careful not to draw attention. His mission to expose corruption in the precinct was yielding results, but he needed concrete evidence, not just observations. 3 blocks away, officers Jake Sullivan and Tom Reynolds received a call over their radio. Suspicious individual, possibly armed, dark hoodie, heading east on Marshall Street. The description was vague, but in their minds, it was enough. Jake's hand instinctively tightened on the steering wheel as Tom called in their response. Unit 247 responding, Tom reported, his voice carrying the weight of 8 years on the force. They'd worked this neighborhood long enough to develop what they called instincts, though these instincts often manifested as prejudices they refused to acknowledge. Malik noticed the patrol car before it noticed him. His training kicked in, and he maintained his pace, showing no signs of concern. He had his FBI credentials in his inner pocket, but revealing his identity would compromise months of careful investigation. The patrol car slowed beside him, and Malik could feel the officer's eyes boring into him. The next moments unfolded with frightening speed. 2 car doors slammed simultaneously. "Stop right there." Jake's voice rang out, harsh and commanding. Malik froze, weighing his options. Without warning, Tom rushed forward, tackling Malik from behind. Jake joined in, his knee pressing into Malik's back as they forced him to the ground. "I'm not resisting," Malik managed to say, his face pressed against the rough concrete. He could taste blood from where his lip had split on impact. The weight on his back increased as Jake dug his knee in deeper. "Shut up," Tom snarled, roughly handling Malik's arms into handcuffs. Neither officer had identified themselves, and neither had given Malik a chance to explain. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as backup units responded to Tom's call for assistance. Malik felt his consciousness wavering as the pressure on his chest made it difficult to breathe. His last coherent thought before darkness crept in was of his handler, who had warned him about exactly this scenario. As his vision blurred, he could hear confused voices above him, someone saying they'd found a badge, and the sudden shift in tone from aggressive to panicked. The encounter lasted less than 5 minutes, but its consequences would ripple through the department and the community for months to come. Jake and Tom had just assaulted a federal agent, and their actions would soon force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about law enforcement, prejudice, and the thin line between protection and abuse of power. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Malik's bruised face as he drifted in and out of consciousness. 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, and multiple contusions, the doctor's assessment was clinical and detached. Outside his room, 2 FBI agents stood guard, their presence a silent reminder that the situation had escalated beyond a simple case of police misconduct. In the hospital's waiting area, Jake sat with his head in his hands, his uniform still dusty from the encounter. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. He replayed the scene repeatedly in his mind, the tackle, the knee in the back, the moment they discovered the FBI credentials. His stomach churned with each recollection. "Officer Sullivan," a stern voice called. Captain Harris stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Internal Affairs is waiting for your statement." Jake stood, his legs shaky. As he followed the captain, he caught a glimpse of Tom being questioned by 2 suits in a nearby conference room. The Internal Affairs interview room felt suffocating. Jake sat across from Investigator Martinez, who spread several photographs across the table, images of Malik's injuries, his FBI badge, the scene of the incident. "Walk me through it again, Officer Sullivan," Martinez demanded. "Why didn't you identify yourselves before engaging?" In another part of the hospital, FBI Special Agent Sarah Chin sat beside Malik's bed, her laptop open to a secure chat with their superiors in Washington. 3 months of surveillance potentially compromised, she typed. Subject's cover may be blown. Request guidance on how to proceed with the corruption investigation. Tom's interview took a different turn. Unlike Jake's visible remorse, he maintained a defensive posture. We followed protocol, he insisted, though his voice wavered slightly. The suspect matched the description of a reported armed individual. The internal affairs investigators exchanged knowing looks, they'd heard this justification too many times before. By evening, the incident had reached the local news. FBI agent assaulted during police stop flashed across screens throughout the city. The police department's public relations team scrambled to contain the damage, but social media was already aflame with video clips captured by nearby residents. Chief Wilson called an emergency meeting with his command staff. The conference room buzzed with tension as he laid out the severity of the situation. This isn't just about excessive force, he stated grimly. We've potentially interfered with a federal investigation. The FBI wants answers, and so does the mayor. Back in his hospital room, Malik finally regained full consciousness. His first thoughts weren't of his injuries but of his mission. The operation, he whispered to Agent Chen. We need to salvage it. Chen nodded, understanding the implications. The corruption they were investigating ran deep, and this incident, though unfortunate, might provide an unexpected avenue to expose it. Jake spent the night at his desk, completing paperwork and mandatory incident reports. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to Tom's empty desk across from him. Their partnership of 3 years suddenly felt like a liability. He thought about the moment they'd received the call, how quickly they'd jump to conclusions, how easily they'd let their biases take control. The department's internal affairs division worked through the night, reviewing body camera footage, witness statements, and procedural violations. The preliminary report painted a damning picture of racial profiling and excessive force. Moreover, questions began to emerge about the source of the original suspicious person call that had led Jake and Tom to Malik. 2 weeks after the incident, Jake found himself sitting in a community center, feeling distinctly out of place. Lisa Martinez, a well-known civil rights activist, stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding attention despite her small stature. She'd invited him here after reaching out through official channels, promising a perspective he desperately needed. What you see as a routine stop, Lisa addressed Jake directly, we experience as trauma passed down through generations. The room was filled with local residents, each face carrying stories of similar encounters. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat as community members shared their experiences, stories of sons arrested without cause, daughters frightened by aggressive officers, elderly parents humiliated during traffic stops. Meanwhile, across town, Tom sat in O'Malley's bar with a group of fellow officers who'd gathered to show their support. It could have happened to any of us, one officer declared, raising his glass. They're just looking for someone to blame. Tom nodded along, but something felt hollow about their reassurances. He thought about Jake's absence, about the growing distance between them since the incident. Malik had begun making cautious appearances in the neighborhood, his injuries still visible but healing. His presence sparked whispered conversations among residents who now saw him as a symbol of resistance. Without revealing his FBI status, he carefully built relationships, gathering intelligence about police misconduct while maintaining his cover. Lisa's words haunted Jake long after the community meeting ended. Your badge doesn't make you right, she'd told him. It makes you responsible. He found himself driving through the neighborhood during his off hours, seeing it through new eyes. The suspicious behavior he'd previously reported now looked like fathers walking their children to school, teenagers hanging out after basketball practice. The division within the police department deepened. A group of officers, led informally by Tom, maintained a defensive stance, arguing that second-guessing their instincts would get them killed. They avoided Jake, viewing his attendance at community meetings as a betrayal. You're choosing them over us, Tom confronted him in the locker room one morning. There is no them, Jake responded, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this mess. The argument that followed drew attention from other officers, some nodding in agreement with Jake, others clustering around Tom. Malik observed these dynamics from his unique position, gathering intelligence that went beyond his original corruption investigation. He documented how officers like Tom influenced newer recruits, perpetuating a culture of us versus them mentality. Yet he also noted officers like Jake, whose consciousness had been awakened by the incident. Lisa began inviting Jake to more community events, noting his genuine desire to understand and change. She introduced him to young activists, elderly community leaders, and local business owners who shared their perspectives on policing. Each conversation chipped away at the armor of prejudice he'd built over his years on the force. Tom watched these changes in his former partner with growing resentment. He began gathering his own supporters within the department, officers who believed Jake's transformation threatened their ability to do their jobs effectively. The divide between the two former partners became a microcosm of the larger struggle within law enforcement. Malik's investigation accelerated unexpectedly following his assault. The incident had inadvertently provided him access to new channels of information. Officers who believed they were sympathizing with a victim of police brutality began speaking more freely around him, unknowingly revealing details about the department's darker operations. Late one night, while reviewing surveillance footage in his temporary safe house, Malik discovered a pattern. The same officers who'd been accepting payments from local businesses were regularly meeting with Lieutenant Harrison, a veteran officer with connections to City Hall. Bank records showed suspicious deposits coinciding with these meetings. Jake's own discoveries paralleled Malik's investigation, though he remained unaware of the FBI's involvement. During a routine evidence filing, he noticed discrepancies in drug seizure reports. Quantities documented at crime scenes consistently showed up smaller in official records. The missing amounts never appeared in evidence logs, yet certain officers seemed to be living well beyond their means. "Something's not right with Harrison's unit," Jake confided in Lisa during one of their regular meetings. She listened intently as he detailed his observations, connecting them to community complaints she'd received about officers demanding protection money from local businesses. Tom, meanwhile, found himself drawn deeper into the corruption he'd been trying to ignore. Lieutenant Harrison approached him after a shift, offering him a chance to supplement his income in exchange for his silence about certain departmental practices. The offer came with an implicit threat. Officers who didn't play along often found themselves assigned to the most dangerous beats without backup. Malik's handler at the FBI grew increasingly concerned about the investigation's scope. "We're not just looking at street-level corruption anymore," Malik reported during a secure communication. "This goes all the way up to city officials. I've identified at least 3 council members who are receiving regular payments." The pressure began to show in unexpected ways. Jake noticed his patrol car's brake lines had been tampered with after he started asking questions about missing evidence. Tom observed fellow officers conducting unofficial security meetings with business owners after hours, but his attempts to rationalize their actions became increasingly difficult. During a late-night surveillance operation, Malik photographed Lieutenant Harrison meeting with Councilman Rogers in an abandoned warehouse. The exchange of money was clear in the images, but more disturbing was the discussion he overheard about managing community activists who were getting too close to the truth. Jake's growing awareness of departmental corruption placed him in an impossible position. His newfound clarity about racial bias now extended to understanding how corruption and prejudice work together to victimize vulnerable communities. The same officers who profiled minorities were often the ones involved in illegal activities. The investigation reached a critical point when Malik discovered evidence of a larger criminal enterprise. The corruption wasn't just about protection money or missing evidence. The department was actively facilitating drug trafficking through the city, with certain officers ensuring safe passages for shipments while arresting independent dealers who didn't pay for protection. As Malik delved deeper into the corruption network, he made a calculated risk. His injuries from the assault had earned him credibility with both the community and corrupt officers, creating a unique opportunity to penetrate deeper into the organization. He began attending unofficial meetings at O'Malley's bar, where compromised officers gathered to discuss their operations. Lieutenant Harrison, believing Malik to be a potential recruit due to his apparent resentment toward the department, started testing his loyalty with small tasks. Each assignment was carefully designed to implicate Malik in their criminal activities while providing him with crucial evidence for the FBI's investigation. Jake's transformation continued through his work with Lisa. After another community meeting, she pulled him aside. "I know you've been investigating Harrison," she whispered, sliding a USB drive across the table. "These are recordings from shop owners who've been paying protection money. They trust you now, Jake. They want to help." The weight of this trust hit Jake hard. He'd spent years seeing these same business owners as potential criminals or problems to manage. Now they were allies, risking their safety to expose corruption. His perspective had shifted so dramatically that his old worldview seemed like a stranger's memory. Tom observed these developments with growing unease. He'd accepted Harrison's offer but found himself trapped in an escalating series of compromises. Each time he looked the other way or helped cover up illegal activities, the guilt ate at him more. Watching Jake's growing relationship with the community only intensified his internal conflict. During a particularly tense evening, Malik orchestrated a meeting between himself and Jake, carefully maintaining his cover while gauging Jake's potential as an ally. "I hear you've been asking questions about Harrison," Malik began, watching Jake's reactions closely. Questions that could get a person hurt. Jake studied Malik's face, still bearing faint scars from their violent encounter. "I owe the community more than silence," he responded, his voice firm despite his obvious fear. This moment marked a turning point, two men, from opposite sides of a broken system, recognizing a common enemy. Lisa became the crucial bridge between Malik's covert operation and Jake's internal investigation. Without revealing Malik's true identity, she helped coordinate their efforts, ensuring their investigations complemented rather than compromised each other. Her network of community contacts provided vital intelligence while maintaining everyone's cover. Tom's position grew more precarious. Harrison, suspicious of Jake's activities, ordered Tom to spy on his former partner. The request forced Tom to confront the moral decay he'd accepted. He began documenting Harrison's operations, telling himself it was insurance, though deep down he knew he was gathering evidence. The alliance between Malik and Jake strengthened through carefully orchestrated, chance meetings. Each man shared selected information, building a more complete picture of the corruption they were fighting. Malik recognized in Jake something rare, an officer willing to confront his own prejudices and fight for change. Malik's breakthrough came when an evidence clerk named Martinez approached him after hours. Trembling and constantly looking over his shoulder, Martinez revealed he'd been maintaining a secret ledger of every illegal transaction that passed through the department. "I kept records," he whispered, "because someday someone would need to know the truth." The ledger was comprehensive: dates, amounts, names of officers involved, and connections to city officials. It documented years of systematic corruption, from traffic ticket fixing to drug trafficking protection. Most crucially, it contained account numbers and transaction records that could be verified independently. Jake, unaware of Martinez's revelation to Malik, made his own decisive move. He'd spent weeks gathering testimonies from business owners and fellow officers who wanted to come clean. During a private meeting with Lisa, he revealed the full scope of his evidence. "I can't do this alone," he admitted. "The department will bury this if we don't play it right." Lisa connected Jake with journalists she trusted, but warned him about the risks. "Once this starts," she cautioned, "there's no going back. They'll come after you with everything they have." Jake understood. He'd seen how the department destroyed whistleblowers before. Tom, caught in an increasingly precarious position, overheard Harrison discussing plans to handle Jake permanently. The casual way his superiors talked about eliminating a fellow officer shattered Tom's last illusions about whose side he was really on. That night, he copied files from Harrison's computer onto a flash drive. Malik received urgent communication from his FBI handlers. They discovered that Councilman Rogers was planning to transfer massive amounts of money offshore. The operation's timeline suddenly accelerated. They couldn't risk losing the financial evidence that would connect the corruption to City Hall. In a dimly lit parking garage, Jake found an envelope on his windshield. Inside was a flash drive and a note: "I was wrong. Meeting tonight, Pier 17, midnight." Tom and Jake spent hours debating whether to go, knowing it could be a trap. Finally, his need for allies outweighed his caution. The meeting at the pier revealed Tom's complete transformation. "I've got everything," he told Jake, his voice raw with emotion. "Account numbers, video recordings, names of everyone involved. I can't live with this anymore." As they talked, neither man noticed the shadows moving at the edge of their vision. Malik, conducting surveillance nearby, spotted Harrison's men approaching the pier. He had seconds to decide, maintain his cover or prevent another assault. The choice was made more complex by his knowledge that the FBI was planning to move on the whole operation within days. The tension exploded when Harrison himself emerged from the darkness, flanked by corrupt officers. "I'm disappointed, Tom," he said, his hand resting on his weapon. "I thought you understood how things work here." The confrontation seemed destined for violence until patrol cars suddenly appeared, responding to an anonymous tip about suspicious activity near the pier. The FBI's operations center hummed with activity as Malik prepared for the final phase. Surveillance teams took position around the precinct and key locations throughout the city. Agent Chin handed Malik his badge and service weapon, marking the end of his undercover role. "Whatever happens," she said, "remember we need Rogers and Harrison alive to testify." Jake sat in his apartment, methodically checking his equipment. The weight of his service weapon felt different now, knowing he might have to use it against fellow officers. His phone buzzed, a text from Lisa, "Community's got your back. Be safe." Outside, supporters had begun gathering near the precinct, their presence a silent witness to what was about to unfold. Tom paced nervously in the precinct parking lot, his copy of Harrison's files heavy in his pocket. He'd agreed to wear a wire, understanding this might be his only chance at redemption. Through his earpiece, he could hear Harrison gathering his loyal officers for what they thought would be a normal morning briefing. The operation began at 7 a.m. sharp. FBI teams simultaneously moved on multiple locations, the precinct, City Hall, and several businesses involved in the corruption network. Malik led the team entering the precinct, his badge now prominently displayed. The shock on corrupt officers' faces at seeing the men they'd assaulted now leading a federal raid was palpable. "FBI. Everyone on the ground." Malik's voice boomed through the precinct. Most officers complied immediately, but Harrison's inner circle reached for their weapons. Jake, already inside, drew his gun on fellow officers for the first time in his career, positioning himself to protect the evidence room. Tom's wire captured Harrison's panic as the raid unfolded. "Burn everything," Harrison ordered, not realizing that Tom had already secured copies of all incriminating files. When Harrison realized Tom's betrayal, he attacked him in blind rage. The struggle sent both men crashing through a glass partition. Outside, Lisa coordinated with community leaders to maintain calm as news of the raid spread. Crowds gathered, not to protest but to witness justice finally reaching those who had abused their power. Local news crews arrived, their cameras capturing the unprecedented scene of FBI agents leading senior officers out in handcuffs. Councilman Rogers attempted to flee the city but found every exit blocked. His private plane was grounded, his boat seized, and his escape routes cut off. The look of disbelief on his face as Malik personally arrested him spoke volumes about the power shift taking place. The confrontation reached its climax in the precinct's main hall. Harrison, cornered but still dangerous, took a rookie officer hostage. "You're destroying everything we built," he snarled at Malik. The standoff drew tense as Harrison's finger tightened on the trigger. Jake, seeing an opening, tackled Harrison from behind. The ensuing struggle was brutal but brief. As Jake and Tom secured Harrison, Malik safeguarded the evidence that would dismantle decades of corruption. The great confrontation had ended not with a massive shootout, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. The precinct erupted into chaos as Harrison's supporters made their last stand. Gunfire echoed through the corridors as corrupt officers, realizing they faced federal charges, chose desperate resistance over surrender. Malik and Jake found themselves pinned down behind a desk, trading shots with officers they'd worked alongside just days before. "East corridors clear." Agent Chen's voice crackled over the radio. Her team had secured the evidence room, protecting crucial documents from destruction. But in the basement, Harrison's most loyal officers were destroying records as quickly as they could, knowing each shredded document might save them years in prison. Tom moved through the chaos with singular purpose, heading toward the records room where he knew Harrison had hidden his most damning files. As he rounded a corner, he came face to face with Officer Rodriguez, one of Harrison's closest allies. Their weapons drawn, they faced each other in a tense standoff. "You betrayed us," Rodriguez spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. Tom saw the conflict in his former friend's eyes, the same conflict he'd wrestled with for months. "No," Tom replied, "I betrayed my oath when I joined Harrison. Just like you did." Upstairs, Malik coordinated with SWAT teams to systematically clear the building. Each office and corridor became a potential ambush site. The sound of breaking glass and splintering would fill the air as barricaded officers resisted arrest. Through it all, Malik maintained strict orders, minimal force, no casualties. Jake found himself in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle with his former academy classmate, Officer Stevens. As they fought, Stevens screamed accusations of betrayal, his words cutting deeper than his blows. "We protected you," Stevens shouted. "We were family." Jake's response was simple: family doesn't corrupt family. The evidence room became the focal point of the most intense fighting. Harrison's men knew that if those files reached federal prosecutors, dozens of officers and city officials would face lengthy prison terms. They launched a desperate assault to reach the room, forcing Malik and Jake to make a final stand at its entrance. In the basement, Tom's confrontation with Rodriguez reached its breaking point. "Think about your kids," Tom urged, seeing photos of Rodriguez's family on his desk. "What will they think when they learn what their father was part of?" The words hit home, and slowly, Rodriguez lowered his weapon. The turning point came when Lisa's voice echoed through the precinct's external speakers. She broadcast a message to the barricaded officers: "Your families are outside. They're watching. Choose your next actions carefully." The impact was immediate. One by one, officers began surrendering, choosing family over a corrupt brotherhood. As the dust settled, Malik, Jake, and Tom stood in the devastated precinct, surveying the aftermath. The building bore the scars of the confrontation: bullet holes in walls, shattered windows, overturned furniture. But more striking was the psychological damage: officers leading away colleagues in handcuffs, decades-long partnerships destroyed by the revelation of corruption. The weeks following the raid transformed the precinct into something unrecognizable. Empty desks stood as silent testimonies to arrested officers, while FBI agents combed through decades of files. Malik, now openly working as the lead federal investigator, set up command in the former captain's office, coordinating the massive effort to document every instance of corruption. News outlets descended on the city, broadcasting images of perp walks as more arrests followed. Councilman Rogers, Lieutenant Harrison, and dozens of officers faced federal charges. The evidence was overwhelming: Tom's recordings, Jake's documented testimonies, and Martinez's ledger created an airtight case that sent shockwaves through law enforcement nationwide. Jake found himself in an unexpected position: interim leader of the decimated precinct. The FBI, recognizing his role in exposing the corruption, tasked him with maintaining basic police operations while the department rebuilt. Each morning, he faced the challenge of motivating the remaining officers, many still processing their colleagues' betrayal. Community meetings took on a different tone. Lisa worked alongside Jake to establish new oversight committees, ensuring community voices would be heard in the department's reconstruction. "This isn't just about removing bad officers," she explained during a packed session. "It's about building something that never existed here: true partnership between police and community." Tom's cooperation with federal prosecutors earned him a reduced sentence, but more importantly, it provided crucial testimony that helped convict the corruption's ringleaders. From the witness stand, he detailed how the system had corrupted well-meaning officers, turning protectors into predators through a gradual erosion of values. Malik's investigation expanded beyond the precinct, following money trails that led to judges, prosecutors, and business leaders. Each new arrest reinforced the community's understanding of how deeply corruption had infected their city. But alongside the revelations came hope. Honest officers from other precincts volunteered to help rebuild, drawn by the chance to be part of real change. The department underwent a complete restructuring. Jake implemented new training programs focusing on community engagement and ethical decision-making. Every policy was reviewed, every procedure questioned. Officers who had stayed clean during Harrison's reign stepped into leadership roles, mentoring a new generation recruited with community input. Lisa's activist network transformed into a formal advisory board, working directly with the department to develop new policies. Their first major victory was the creation of a civilian oversight committee with real power to investigate misconduct. "This is what accountability looks like," Lisa announced as the measure passed. Tom, even from behind bars, contributed to the department's redemption. His detailed accounts of how corruption spread helped design new safeguards and training protocols. His story became a cautionary tale taught to every new recruit, a reminder that the line between right and wrong blurs slowly, one compromise at a time. The precinct's physical transformation matched its institutional changes. Glass walls replaced solid barriers, creating transparency both literally and symbolically. Community members could now walk freely through much of the building, a radical departure from the fortress mentality of the past. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension on the trial's opening day. Lieutenant Harrison sat at the defendant's table, his once pristine uniform replaced by prison orange. Behind him, rows of spectators included victims of his corruption scheme, honest officers he'd threatened, and community members who'd suffered under his regime. Malik took the stand first, his testimony methodically unraveling decades of corruption. He detailed how the assault on him had inadvertently exposed the entire network. Harrison's face darkened with each revelation, his eyes fixed on the men whose beating should have silenced opposition but instead triggered its downfall. Jake watched from the gallery as Tom testified against their former colleagues. Each confession seemed to age Tom visibly, describing how they'd extorted businesses, planted evidence, and protected drug shipments. When Tom detailed Harrison's order to handle Jake permanently, the courtroom fell silent, the depth of the corruption finally hitting home. "Look at your former captain now," Lisa whispered to Jake, as Harrison's composure cracked during cross-examination. The lieutenant's attempts to justify his actions as maintaining order fell apart under the prosecutor's relentless questioning. His claims of protecting the community rang hollow against evidence of the lives he'd destroyed. Community members testified about years of harassment, false arrests, and extortion. Business owners described how protection money had nearly bankrupted them. Each testimony built the case higher, but it was the evidence from Martinez's ledger that proved devastating: dates, amounts, and names creating an undeniable pattern of systematic corruption. Tom's sentencing came midway through the trial. Standing before the judge, he spoke without notes: "I failed my oath, my community, and myself. Every day I spend in prison will be spent reflecting on how to make amends." The judge acknowledged his cooperation but emphasized accountability: 15 years, with possibility of parole after 8. The prosecution's final witness was a young officer who'd resisted Harrison's corruption. She described how Harrison's men had staged a drug bust in her patrol car, threatening to frame her if she didn't cooperate. Her testimony crystallized the choice every officer faced: participate in corruption or become its victim. Harrison's conviction came after 6 weeks of trial. The judge's sentence was unequivocal: life imprisonment without parole. "You didn't just break the law," the judge declared, "you broke the sacred trust between police and community. Your actions poisoned that relationship for generations." In the aftermath, Malik received a promotion but chose to stay in the city, heading a new FBI task force on police corruption. Jake continued leading the reformed precinct, working closely with Lisa's oversight committee to ensure transparency. Their weekly meetings, once battlegrounds, became workshops for building trust. 1 year after the raids, the precinct held an open house. Community members walked freely through halls once ruled by fear. Children played with K-9 units while their parents chatted with officers. In his new office, Jake kept 2 photos, one of Tom being sentenced, another of the first graduating class of new officers trained under the reformed system. Together, they reminded him daily of both the cost of corruption and the possibility of redemption.